podcaster. Welcome to the Podcast Mix.
Podcast Mix.
Hello, podcaster. I'm Nick, and welcome to the first episode of the Podcast Mix. In this episode, I'm going to talk all about pre-planning your podcast. This is one of the most important things you can do to set yourself up for success. Not only for when you're launching your podcast, but 6 months, a year, 2 years down the line. You'll be able to reference this stuff again and again to keep you on track and delivering perfectly tailored content to your listeners. If you don't do this, you're going to be putting in a ton of hard work with no clear vision on who you're making your podcast for and why you're making it, and wondering why no one is listening. A few things I'm going to talk about are: figure out who you're making your podcast for, why you're making your podcast, what incentive do people have to listen, how to pick your name, cover art, description writing, and equipment. There's going to be a downloadable PDF that you can get from the website, so you can make notes if you want. I recommend you do. Or you can grab the PDF, or you can do both, whatever you want. If you have a question while you're listening and want answers right away, go down to the description, pick a way to get in touch, and ask. So, who are you creating your podcast for? Just like you'd make an ideal customer profile for your business, you should make an ideal listener profile for your podcast. This is especially useful if you're using your podcast as an extension of your brand or as a marketing strategy. Or maybe you plan to use your podcast in place of an industry newsletter and want to send it around to industry peers and colleagues. No matter what you want to use your podcast for, write down who your ideal listener is. Write down their age. If it's a wide age range, make sure you're appealing to all ages. Write down their gender. For example, if you're an expert in men's lifestyle, then you'll probably have mostly men listening. It also may not be defined, so appeal to everyone if that's the case. Write down where in the world they are. Is the podcast for a local municipality? Is it for your state or province? Will it be shared internally around your company? Does your company have multiple locations? Write down all of your company's locations if this is the case. Write down their occupation. Are they personal fitness trainers, accountants? Write down their income range. Write down their interests. Write down whatever else applies to your ideal listener. For example, the ideal listener profile that I have for this podcast is for people ages 25 to 50. There's no gender or race specification. Everyone's welcome. It's for people located in the US and Canada or any English-speaking country. There's no specific occupation, but we are talking to high-performing entrepreneurs, small business owners, and people who work in branding and marketing who also have the means to start a podcast and outsource their production. And we're also talking to people who know about podcasting and who are interested. For us, it's a pretty wide demographic, which has made it hard to focus in on our listener, but the more you can narrow it down, the easier it'll be to not only create the best content for your listener, but to find them when you're promoting your podcast. So we've just figured out your who your podcast is for. Now we need to figure out your why. Why are you creating your podcast? And if you're creating your podcast as a marketing tool, I suggest putting a little more thought into it than just to convert sales. If money is your why, you run the risk of creating subpar content that doesn't connect with anybody, or worse, content that repels people and eventually leads to your podcast failing. The goal here is to set yourself up for success. My why stems from the why I got into the music industry as an audio engineer and producer years ago. During that time, as I got further and further along, I realized that the people I was meeting and working with were in pursuit of a dream to make music and leave their mark on the world and to create something. I always became an integral part of that pursuit. My why became helping these people achieve their dreams. In my opinion, to start a podcast means that you want to share something with the world. You want to create something. This to me says that you have a dream of doing something for the world that will leave a mark, a legacy, something bigger than you and meant for other people to gain something from. My why is not far off from my why all those years ago in the music industry. I not only want to help you create your legacy and leave your mark, but I also want podcasting to continue to grow as a medium so that anyone who wants the opportunity to also leave their mark can do it. So what's your why? I suggest you take some time and put some thought into why you want to create your podcast. Then create from that place. The quality of your content will be reflected in the reason why you started the podcast in the first place. So you've just figured out who you're making your podcast for and why you're making it. Now you need to figure out why people are going to listen. What sets your podcast apart from others? The first place to look to figure this out is to yourself. People are going to connect with you before anything else. Your personality or personalities if there are more than one host. So be yourself. There's only one you, and you're like no one else. Your opinions, beliefs, and expertise are going to be the best way to set yourself apart. So it's really important that you be your true self. Other ways that will draw people to your podcast are, do you solve a problem? Do you offer something like a Facebook group where listeners can go and chat and form a community? For me in this podcast, instead of going deep into podcasting and the industry and really talking nuts and bolts, I wanted to create something that is really easy to follow and that people can use right away to start their podcast quickly and easily. I didn't want to get into RSS feeds and how they work and how metadata affects Apple Podcasts and stuff like that. There's actually a lot of podcasts covering that stuff already. So I designed this one to get you and your podcast going as easily and as straightforward as possible. So why are people going to listen to your podcast over someone else's? Up until this point, the stuff I've been talking about might be the most important part of it. It's the stuff that's going to become the basis of your podcast. Everything you do will stem from pre-planning who the podcast is for, why you're making the podcast, why people will listen, and what sets your podcast apart from others. If you spend even a little bit of time thinking about this stuff, your podcast will be better than most of the podcasts out there. Now, every great podcast needs a great name. Picking a name can be either super hard or super easy. For some people, the name will just pop into their head, but for others, it'll take a little longer. And then there's dealing with the possibility that the name you want to use is already in use. If it's already in use, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use it, but I don't recommend it. It'll be harder to get your ranking up if there's already an established podcast with the same name, and the other person could have already trademarked that name, which is something that we're seeing more and more these days in podcasting. The first thing to do here is to make a list of possible names. Now, the possible names you come up with might be directly related to what you're talking about, like the art of personal fitness, if your podcast is for personal trainers. But it doesn't have to be. Get creative. The more important thing here is that you choose a name that ideally hasn't been used yet, and it's something that you can build a brand around and effectively market. Once you've got a bit of a list going, jump on Google and start searching to see if you can find podcasts with the same name. You're going to want to also look to see if there's anything else totally unrelated to podcasting that might get in your way also. The more unique, the better. Another thing to take into consideration that will help a lot is who are your hosts. If you or one of your hosts are a person of note, including their name and the name of the podcast will go a long way for SEO and discoverability. Just searching that person's name alone, which a lot of people are probably doing if they're a person of note, will bring your podcast up through Google quicker. Okay, your podcast will also need a description, an overall summary of what your podcast is about. It's going to help people decide if they want to listen or not. Now, this is different from your episode description or show notes. Those are for summarizing each episode. The first thing to start with while writing your description is to write down the goal for your podcast in 1 to 2 sentences. From there, you'll be able to better write a summary that will help your listener understand how subscribing to your podcast will impact their lives. Try not to be too fancy with it. Just write in clear, concise, and simple language. Make sure to include if you're going to be interviewing people or not. If you are, quickly let them know what kind of people they can expect to hear from. Or if you're going to be making a solo show, let them know about what you'll be talking about. The most important thing to achieve with your description is to make it about your listeners, not about you. You want them to say to themselves, yes, this is exactly what I was looking for. They need to feel like you care about them first. That's the only way to win them over. The last point I'd like to make about your description is to not make it too long. People will skip over it if you do. Keep it short, simple, and easy to read, and really sell it. Before we move on to how long your podcast should be, it's a good time to talk a bit about how your podcast will be formatted. In a way, it'll help decide how long each episode should be, which is what we'll talk about next. So, there are a few types of formats. This solo format, where it's just you, one person speaking about their topic of interest, is pretty straightforward. There's also an ensemble or roundtable type podcast where 2 or more people are together discussing a topic of interest, which is a little more complicated because of how you'll have to have your equipment set up. And then there's the interview podcast, which can be 1 host and a guest, or 2 hosts and a guest, or 2 guests and 2 hosts. There's all kinds of combinations here. How you decide what your format will be, again, will stem from the goal or reason you're creating your podcast. For example, I wanted this podcast to be more of an educational how-to type podcast. So the solo format really works for me. It allows me to stay focused and deliver the content in a very linear way. If I had a co-host, I'd be worried that we might go off on too many tangents, which would make it too hard to follow. So take a bit of time and think about what the best way is for you to deliver your message as clearly as possible when deciding your format. One of the questions I get a lot is, how long should my podcast be? There's no one answer to this question, but in my opinion, no episodic podcast should be longer than 60 minutes, 1 hour tops. And according to the people who have done the research, the average length of a podcast is about 37 minutes, which means the sweet spot will be between 30 to 45 minutes. Some things I've noticed that might help you figure out what will work best for you is if you're going to be making an interview podcast, 60 minutes is usually the easiest way to go, especially if you're interviewing more than one person. It lets everyone say their piece without rushing anything and keeps everyone a little more relaxed because there's just no pressure. You for sure don't want to go any less than 40 to 45 minutes for interviews. Also, if you're making a solo podcast, 20 to 30 minutes on the top end is probably what most will be able to keep up with. It's tough doing a solo podcast and keeping the energy up and creating that much content. Also, I've come across, 5-minute podcast episodes, and I always feel left wanting more and dissatisfied with not getting enough from them. So I wouldn't go that short either. Ultimately, the way to decide how long your podcast episodes should be is to think about what you're able to handle consistently while creating high quality content. One thing to avoid is promising something and not being able to keep it up. Or worse yet, putting out useless information to your listeners. You can always start and see how you feel about your lengths and then adjust from there until you figure out what works best for you and everyone involved. This is a perfect segue into the next thing we're going to talk about. I'm asked this a lot as well. When and how often are you going to release your podcast? This question is a little easier because by far the best way to figure this out is to sit down with everyone who's going to be working on the podcast and decide what day of the week and time of day everyone can stick to consistently without fail. There's any number of combinations here and will be determined by the people involved and what they're able to keep up with. Releasing an episode 1 to 2 times a week is the best if possible. It's not too little that people will crave more and look elsewhere, and it's not too much that people won't fall behind or get overwhelmed with it. Just make sure you can show up when you say you're going to show up. The next thing to consider when launching your podcast is where are you going to record your podcast? Podcasting heavily relies on sound, so how your podcast sounds, the quality of the audio is really important. Typically, people think that it's the equipment that matters the most when it comes to high quality sound. It's not. It's the environment that you record in. Let's try something. Stop whatever you're doing and pay attention to the sound that's happening around you right now. Maybe you can hear the fridge or the furnace or the noise from kids outside or cars passing by. There's a ton of noise happening. Now, if you were going to record your podcast where you are right now, your microphone will also record every single sound that you can hear. That would make for a really noisy and distracting podcast. Also, when you start to talk, your voice is going to bounce off all of the hard surfaces like your walls that are found in the room and also be recorded along with that noise as echo. It'll sound like you're in a parking garage. So figure out where you're going to record your podcast. Choose a quiet room in the back of the house or in the back of the office where there isn't a lot going on. And choose a room that has a lot of soft surfaces like couches and carpets or rugs, heavy drapes, things like that. I'm going to talk much more about this stuff in a later episode, but start thinking about where the quietest available room is and plan to record there. It's very important. Cover art, which is the image that will be associated with your podcast. I find a lot of people have problems with this one because the specs for cover art are very particular. And if the specs are off, your podcast won't be accepted onto places like iTunes and Spotify. So I'll give you the specs right now. Write it down if you can. I'll also put it in the description. The dimensions of your cover art have to be no smaller than 1400 pixels by 1400 pixels and no bigger than 3000 pixels by 3000 pixels. It's got to be JPEG format, and it can't be any larger than 500 kilobytes in size. If you stick to these specs, you'll be fine, but double check before you submit your podcast to the directories, which we'll talk about later on, because you risk wasting a lot of time for something so small, and it can be hard to find. So what should your cover art look like? Well, that's up to you. In my case with this podcast, I'm using it as part of Mike Me's brand. So I'm creating the content for our community to use to their benefit. So the cover art is aligned with Mike Me's branding. The colors, the fonts, the pictures, all designed to reflect what Mike Me is all about. So take into consideration why you're creating your podcast. Again, go back to the who and the why and design your cover art so that it can be packaged to round out your branding and make it marketable. If your podcast is part of your company or business, use the same type of designs. And if your podcast will be left to stand on its own, it's definitely in your best interest to create a marketable brand around your podcast. Choose colors and fonts and make it into a package. Now, the big question I get all the time is, where do people go to have their cover art made? You may know a graphic designer already that you can use, which is great. But if you don't, you can hire a graphics designer from Upwork or Freelancer. You can go to places like Fiverr. Any of these online marketplaces for where you can find graphic designers will work. All these options will come in varying levels of quality and price, so shop around a bit. This is something that we offer as an option, creating your cover art, when you join us with our launch package where we work with you to launch your podcast. So if you go with a company like us, they might offer the option to do this as well. Okay, so the last point I'm going to touch on here while pre-planning your podcast is recording equipment. I'm not going to go too far into this right now because I've got a whole episode dedicated to it, but start to plan now and educate yourself a bit. The things you'll need for sure are a microphone or microphones, depending on how many people you're recording with. You'll need a computer. Laptops work well because you can stay mobile with them. You'll need audio editing software, and that's it. Those really are the mandatory pieces of equipment. In the equipment episode, I'm going to go into detail about all the other options because there's other options that might work better for you, and you'll figure that out later on. But that's really it. The only other thing I can think of is choosing a service that lets you connect to people remotely. Again, I'll talk about this later on, but it's only needed if you need to have someone on the podcast who lives elsewhere in the world. So start Googling things like microphones for podcasting and audio editing software for podcasting and podcasting equipment in general, so you're ready and already have an idea of the things I'll be talking about. And you can ask questions about this stuff, whenever you want, if you are doing a little bit of research and come across some stuff. So these are the steps on how to pre-plan your podcast. Now, of course, you're probably going to have questions. So please get in touch and ask, because I want to talk to everyone. I really want this podcast to be an open book. And if you have questions right now, before you get started, or maybe you're in the middle of pre-planning and need some help, or if you want to make sure that we include something specific on future episodes, go right now and get in touch. Here's how. Mike Me Audio or The Nick Perry on Instagram. Mike Me Audio on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, MikeMe.com on the web, and get me directly via email at nick@mikeme.com. All of these will be linked in the description to make it even easier for you to find me. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Podcast Mix, a Mike Me podcast, and I can't wait for you to launch your podcast. Come on!